So I'm delighted to be with Ben Richards of Aura Architecture, XP Property as well. So Ben, massive thanks for being a sponsor first of all, and also presenting in February, this coming month, February 24th. It's a Thursday evening, and it's looking at development trends, focusing specifically on EV. You were fortunate to work for Berkeley, Berkeley Homes. And Berkeley Homes spend a huge amount of money on innovation, sustainability champions, sustainability managers. Do you want to just explain just a little bit about that, and then we'll go into a few more questions about EV, but how you got insight really from working for Berkeley?
Yeah, I mean, they are always at the forefront of kind of innovation and development. I worked there 5 years ago, and even at that point, they were looking into modular housing. They had passive and active sort of EV charging on most of their sites. Like you mentioned, I was a sustainability champion on the sites that I worked on, and I was overseen by a kind of departmental regional sort of head of sustainability that came around and visited various sites to make sure that we were doing and implementing the things that we should be doing from a sustainability perspective. They've been around for 40 years. The schemes that I worked on were close to £1 billion in gross development value, big schemes in central London, and they've grown from doing single one-off houses down in Weybridge to this in the last 40 years. So you don't do that without innovating, pushing things forward, looking ahead, and keeping ahead of the game.
Yeah, that's interesting. 2 points. One, I didn't realize his story. I've met Tony, the former founder. He's passed away unfortunately a couple of years ago, but I didn't realize their journey started in Weybridge and so forth. And because when I see Berkeley, I see huge developments like St. George's, St. Edwards, and so forth, and that there's obvious ones along the River Thames and so forth.
And that's actually a really interesting point that people don't know about the Berkeley Group. We talk all the time as developers about joint ventures. They are genuinely like the most forward-thinking company that I know from a joint venture perspective. We talk about finding asset owners. We send out direct to vendor letters to try and get in there with somebody that owns an asset that has potential to unlock and then develop and share profits. What the Berkeley Group have done very successfully over the last 20-30 years is found those joint venture partners on a massive scale. So you mentioned St. William, St. George, St. James. All of those subsidiaries are joint ventures. So St. James is a joint venture with Thames Water. Now you can imagine Thames Water owns so much land and most of its riverfront prime real estate. St. William is the new joint venture that kind of started when I was there actually. So I worked on the very first St. William project, which was a joint venture between the Berkeley Group and National Grid. So National Grid again have gas holder sites throughout London, prime real estate, and the Berkeley Group help unlock and deliver the potential that those sites provide. So we talk about development trends, and JVs are always fundamental to developers sort of growing and growing at speed. They have massive joint ventures. They've proved themselves as delivery partners, and that's why they can land such amazing joint venture partners that hold an insane amount of assets and land for them to develop.
So just a key point on passive and active. So just before we did this recording, you mentioned passive and active, and maybe there is some jargon. I call it jargon, but maybe there is some jargon in the EV world. And we're going back to the question about passive and active in just a moment. It's just a short video, but what makes Aura Architecture interested or so interested in the EV? Is it sustainability? Is the profit from being involved in developments? Is it sometimes planning requirements as well?
Yeah, there's a bit of everything. As an architectural practice, we, fundamentally one of our core kind of values and ethos is to be sustainable and think energy efficiently and try to promote that to our clients. From a development perspective as well, from an XP Property and my property development business, we are being driven towards sustainability, thinking more environmentally friendly, and EVs form a part of that. You touched on the planning process. It's becoming more and more prevalent to be for the councils to want EV charging stations as part of developments going forward. So touching on your point about active and passive, active EV charging is basically the charging point is there ready for you to plug in, and all the infrastructure is in place. Passive means that the infrastructure is there ready to go. You just need to then install a charging point to that infrastructure for it to become an active charging station. So on, I think that the Berkeley scheme that I was working on, the council required a certain amount of EV charging points in general. 50% of those needed to be active, 50% of those were passive for basically future upgrades to the system.
Sure. Just before coming online, I just had a quick look. Of course, I do pay much more attention to EV than I did a year or two ago when you first presented on the subject online. Just had a quick look this morning, and it came up with the name George Soros, who's quite famous. He bought almost 20 million shares of electric truck startup. And as you say, EV isn't something which is a fad, which maybe possibly before speaking to you might have expected, because there's clear government objectives by, do you want to explain the dates, 2035, 2040?
Sure, yeah. So this will form part of my my presentation when I speak at your event at the end of the month, which I'm really excited about. I've done a previous, probably 18 months ago, 2 years ago, maybe over lockdown, a brief introduction to EV. But ultimately, there's a real government push by 2035 to ban the manufacturing of petrol, diesel, and hybrid cars. So by 2040, it'll be fully electric cars allowed on the UK roads, and kind of that's it. That's the goal. That taps into a wider and longer government push and EU push, really, to be zero carbon by 2050. And I did a keynote speech on sustainability at your development summit back in January 2020, maybe 2020. And there's a YouTube video on our Aura Architecture page to watch on that. It's sort of 20-25 minutes of how the UK government are pushing towards zero carbon, what they're doing to the building regulations to change the rules to push developers to think more sustainability from an energy perspective, and also from a ventilation perspective, which is also really important in the home.
So Ben, I had a conversation with you just before, and you said it's not just the home counties where XP Property is focused primarily, it's also in London as well. So it's not just one part of the country, and it does encompass all of the UK. Mm-hmm. My final question is, in terms of learnings, what should people expect to learn on the night?
So, I mean, I guess the most important thing for developers is how they can monetize EV charging on their site. We've got some case studies from things that we're doing at the moment. I was actually looking at the presentation I did a couple of years ago for you just now, and there are some significant changes really with what's happened since then and now, and that is the cost of electric. Actually the margins that you can now achieve on EV charging points is smaller, because ultimately the cost that you're paying for that electric is so much higher. Now, the potential for that is that, well, why don't we charge more for the electric being used in our EV charging points? Because ultimately we're paying a base cost that's higher. But that may limit the market for people that actually use your charging stations. If you're up at 50p per kilowatt hour and others are at 35p, which is probably the standard, how much market share are you going to get, because people are just going to try and find cheaper charging stations. So it's all about monetizing EV charging on your site, how to go about it, what you can learn from that process, and also I will be giving some intros to the people that we've used in the past to install our points, and the systems that they put in place to manage those charging points, so you can help maximize the return on investment from them.
So Ben, I just want to say massive thanks for this morning. Massive thanks for joining us on Thursday, the 24th of February. London Bridge Hotel, easy to get to. Tickets online, bequinevents.com/events.